Hey everyone, welcome to the launch of Media Justice's new report, Media Capture: Who Controls the Story Controls the Future. I'm Dulani, Senior Research Specialist at Media Justice.
And I'm Brandon Forster, Senior Campaign Lead at Media Justice. And we would love to hear where you're joining from and what motivated you to join us today. So drop in the chat where you're joining from and make sure you are sending it to everybody and not just the host and panelists so everyone can see where we have folks joining from. Don't be shy.
Where are you joining from, Brandon?
I am joining from Prince George's County, Maryland, just outside of Washington, D.C. Where are you joining us from, Delani?
I am joining from Greenfield, Massachusetts, 3 hours from New York City.
Nice. Oh, nice. We got folks from San Antonio, New Jersey, Chicago, San Francisco. Wonderful. Minneapolis. Wonderful. Folks from San Jose. It's great to see you all here. Oh, we got someone else from Landover out here. Awesome. Southwest. Keep them coming. We're gonna go ahead and keep going so that we stay on time, but keep sharing where you're joining from and what made you join today.
Yeah, so thank you everyone for joining us today. Our new report documents how tech oligarchs are capturing our media system.
And media capture is not just about who owns a newsroom, it's about who controls what stories get told, what investigations move forward, and what information reaches the public and what disappears.
That's right. And we are at an inflection point in media consolidation. You've probably seen the headlines about Netflix losing its bid to buy Warner Brothers Discovery. Paramount Skydance, the media company financed by billionaire Larry Ellison, is now positioned to acquire Warner Brothers. If that deal closes, one family will control TikTok's algorithm along with CNN and CBS News, plus many channels and brands including HBO, BET, MTV, and more. On top of all this media control, Larry Ellison also owns massive data center infrastructure that fuels AI.
Right. And let's take a moment to remember who Larry Ellison is. He's not just a MAGA billionaire, as in a wealthy and extreme conservative. His power is enormous. He's the founder and chair of Oracle, which is one of the largest surveillance companies on earth. They track billions of people through facial recognition cameras, license plate readers, and DNA profiles. And they sell your data to the highest bidder.
So big tech billionaires bankrolled Trump's election. They are profiting from surveillance contracts with ICE. They are building data centers that bring toxic pollution to Black and Latino neighborhoods. They are lobbying against AI regulation. And these same big tech billionaires are buying the outlets and platforms that should be reporting on what they're doing.
That's right. And our report breaks down how big tech has captured our current media system for its own gain. So let's dive into the content and key findings of our new report, Media Capture: Who Controls the Story Controls the Future.
So, our report documents how tech oligarchs are capturing our media system through three interconnected strategies: ownership, financial dependency, and platform control. Let's break these down.
Let's start with platform control. So we all know that the internet, and more specifically social media platforms, have changed the way the majority of people access information.
Right. The facts are that Google controls the search market and Meta's social media platforms reach billions.
And we know that the algorithms behind these platforms are manipulated to maximize engagement and advertising revenue.
And we also know that platforms have become the primary way people access news.
That's right. Over half of Americans now get their news from social media, and these platforms have surpassed television as a news source.
And this shift has drained resources from local newsrooms while concentrating power in the hands of a few tech companies. Local newsrooms are losing an estimated $1.87 billion a year to Google and Facebook's dominance over how news gets distributed.
And with Google's and Facebook's dominance over how news gets distributed, big tech billionaires have captured audiences at scale. As you can see in the infographic, Facebook has 3 times the reach of every major news outlet combined. I'm just going to repeat that really quick. Facebook has 3 times the reach of every major news outlet combined.
Yeah, it is staggering. And we also know that the content that is distributed by these platforms, they don't have to be newsworthy or accurate in order to be profitable. That's why synthetic news generated by artificial intelligence is growing.
That's right. And so now AI is also accelerating the financial drain from news outlets. With AI generated search summaries alone, cutting referrals to publishers' websites by an estimated 25% just in 2025.
Our report documents how big tech billionaires have been extending their power from information gatekeeping in the digital sphere to now buying up traditional and legacy media as well. Let's do a little pop quiz about tech ownership of media and look at who bought what. So we're going to do a little Zoom poll now. All right, our first question is which tech billionaire bought the Washington Post? Was it Mark Zuckerberg, Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, or Larry Ellison? Imagine some Jeopardy music playing. All right, so it looks like most of everyone here knows that it's Jeff Bezos who bought the Washington Post. Um, yeah, we're going to move on to our second question.
All right. Wait for that second poll to get up. All right. So who acquired Time Magazine in 2018 for 190 million? Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, David Sachs, Trump's crypto czar, Mark Benioff, the co-founder and CEO of Salesforce, or Palmer Luckey, yes, that's a real name, owner of Anduril Defense Company. Okay. Let's see what folks decided.
We're still getting some answers.
Okay, thank you. Take your time. Take your time. This one's a little trickier than the first one. I'm sorry we don't have the no idea option. Oh, it looks like there was a split here. But 40% of people did get it right. It's Mark Benioff, the co-founder and CEO of Salesforce, who acquired Time Magazine in 2018 for $190 million. I'll pass it back to you, Delani, for the next question.
All right, we have 4 questions total. This is our third one. So Mark Andreessen, a key ally of President Trump and a major investor in artificial intelligence, made a series of large investments in which media platform? Zoom, LinkedIn, Substack, or Spotify? Yeah, it's very, very legitimate to need an I have no idea option. But this is it. This is us getting to know who owns what. All right, interesting. A lot of folks went for Spotify. So Mark Andreessen has made a series of large investments in Substack, which folks might know, is a subscription-based service providing access to newsletters, podcasts, and videos. So he committed $184 million in total, which accounts for 92% of the company's value.
All right, and our last question. Peter Thiel, the chairman of Palantir, has invested $6 million in which video streaming platform alongside the current vice president, JD Vance? Instagram, TikTok, Rumble, or YouTube? All right, let's see what folks put. Oh, we got a mix here too. And this is another one where folks get a chance to learn. It actually is Rumble. And if you haven't heard of Rumble, you're lucky. It's one of these far right streaming platforms. And with that, I'll pass it back to you, Delani.
Yeah, thanks everyone for participating in this quiz. Hopefully some of it was informative, and we're gonna get more into who these tech billionaires are that own these companies and what the timeline has looked like.
Yeah, so as you can see in this timeline that we're sharing right now on the screen, you can see some of the major tech acquisitions of media companies over the last 20 years across social media, news media, film, and broadcasting. And what might be surprising, just looking at the start, is most people might think that YouTube was actually a company that was started by Google. YouTube was its own independent company that was acquired by YouTube for $1.65 billion. And I don't know if you all saw the news headlines, but they recently just made about $40 billion in ad revenue just from YouTube alone. But as you can see, it's not just about these other kind of social media companies. It's certainly that where they're creating these behemoth monopolies where Facebook owns Instagram and these other companies. But it's also things like buying up the Washington Post, buying up Time Magazine, buying up LinkedIn, buying up major movie studios. And so it's all of these parts of the media ecosystem that they're buying up.
Absolutely. And so, with a small group of tech billionaires capturing the entire media ecosystem, we're seeing the consequences of their editorial control, from censorship to platforming a right-wing agenda. We've seen this when Larry Ellison handpicked Barry Weiss to take control of CBS. We saw how Weiss delayed a critical 60 Minute story about the El Salvadorian prison where many deportees are being sent. We saw Weiss turning CBS recently into a bullhorn for pro-war propaganda. We have seen Jeff Bezos transform the Washington Post when he shifted the editorial board to focus on personal liberties and free markets. And we've seen Mark Benioff, the CEO of Salesforce, who bought Time Magazine, use the news magazine to quote voice his opinions, as one staffer put it, when talking about this billionaire's vocal pro-Trump stances.
So the last aspect of big tech's media monopoly control that we want to highlight is financial dependency. In the last few years, we've seen Meta block users from sharing news articles in Canada and Australia after laws passed that would require big tech actors to pay publishers for the news. In both of these cases, a single company was able to force an entire country to change course. These threats work because newsrooms are already dependent on these companies for money and technology. And that dependency didn't happen overnight. These tech corporations build it deliberately over the past decade through grants, revenue sharing deals, and AI partnerships. And understanding how that dependency works is the key to understanding why the media system can't hold tech accountable.
Right. AI companies are paying out hundreds of millions of dollars to news publishers in content licensing deals. The organizations now dependent on that revenue are the same ones responsible for holding AI accountable. And we're seeing four types of AI deals specifically. The first is content licensing for training AI models. This is where newspapers give their content to AI companies for training. The second is incorporating LLM chatbots and other AI services into employees' work activities, like how the AP is forcing reporters to gather the facts but allowing AI to write the stories. The third type of AI deal we're seeing is advertising revenue that is shared when showing content created by publishers. And lastly, we're seeing AI deals around influencing how publisher content gets displayed in LLM chatbots, like Google's Gemini AI search summaries.
And so companies went from filing lawsuits over the unauthorized and improper usage of their content to signing contracts to be compensated for content used by AI companies to train their LLM chatbots. So that's kind of like if Sam Altman robbed your house and you went from suing Altman for damages to signing a contract that you'd get just a small cut of whatever money he makes from selling your own stolen stuff.
Exactly. So, what this all comes down to is that big tech billionaires are using this media monopoly power to legitimize AI expansion, normalize surveillance, and block any structural solutions that threaten their interests.
That's right. And now we're going to invite the author of the report, Media Justice's own executive director, Stephen Renderos, to summarize some of the key takeaways from the report. So, Stephen, I'll
Awesome.
invite
Thank
you up.
you. Wow, thank you. Really appreciate it. Thank you both, Duani and Brandon, for getting us going. And, before I jump into the takeaways, I wanted to share something a little more personal. Um, so today is actually my 14th anniversary at Media Justice. My first day as a national organizer was on March 12th, 2012. I remember it because I flew to Oakland to attend an in-person staff retreat. And I am sure there are many people on the team who would tell you about the ways that their very first days were getting thrown right into a staff retreat or right into an action or right into an event. That's how we've done it over the years. But I wanted to just like take a moment to tell you how I got here. And I think it'll be important just because it helps to frame up a little bit about why this report matters to me so much. For me, I got into media justice actually because of a war. After 9/11, the Bush administration needed the US public to support an invasion of Iraq. There was actually no real connection between Iraq and the September 11th attacks, and not that war would have ever been justified, even if there was. But the administration knew that, right? And so they manufactured a connection. They told us the story of weapons of mass destructions that were somehow buried throughout Iraq. That was their story. And the media ran with that story. There's an image, I think, from that time that in particular sticks out with me, and that's like the toppling of Saddam Hussein's statue in Baghdad. Um, it was broadcast everywhere by every major news company. Um, and you saw this like frame of the Iraqi people rising up in liberation, tearing down the statue. The thing is, like, if you pull back on that image a bit, you would have seen a pretty nearly empty square. You would have seen US military tanks, like you see there in the image here, forming a perimeter around that square. And you would have seen US military personnel actually directing the whole scene. It was US military personnel that used equipment, US equipment to actually pull the statue down. The whole image that justified a war like was completely staged. And the power of the media is that they helped to make it look real. I understood then, at a pretty gut level, that media isn't this kind of like neutral delivery system for facts. It is a site of power. It decides what story and, more importantly, whose story is worth telling. Lost, I think, in the headlines in that invasion of Iraq was the story of Jose Antonio Gutierrez, who was actually the first U.S. casualty in the war in Iraq. Now, the thing is, like, he wasn't a U.S. citizen. He was actually a Guatemalan immigrant. He was one of the many soldiers that they called green card soldiers, who would join the military in the hopes of, like, gaining an opportunity to stay in the country. And he eventually did become a US citizen, and that was until after his death. Um, but his story to me is a reminder of the kinds of people that are sacrificed along the way in service of stories that protect those in power. And I think we see similar things playing out right now, like in the echoes of the war in Iraq, with what's going on right now in Iran. And you see an administration trying to justify a call to war. Um, and you see a media system that is, right there trying to help them out. Um, I think it just reminds me whoever controls the media shapes what the public believes to be true. What wars are worth fighting? I mean, even heck, like what the hell is a war? And that shapes like what futures are even possible. So since about that time, I really started paying a lot of attention to who controlled the media. Um, and that eventually brought me to media justice. In 2008, I actually found my way to a gathering that was being hosted by this organization. It was right before the beginning of the National Conference on Media Reform, a national conference that used to be hosted by Free Press. Now, at this pre-conference gathering, I actually didn't have an invitation, but a friend of mine had told me about it, and I decided to show up, and crash the event, basically. And when I walked in, my friend told me, "Hey, you gotta go ask that person over there if you can stay." And that person was Malkia Devich Cyril, Media Justice's founder. And I went up, I introduced myself, I told them who I was and what I was into, and they were like, "Sure, you can go ahead and stay." They were probably just like, can I just get this young organizer off of me?" But thankfully they let me stay. And I went to go sit at a table, and sitting at the table were organizers from Prometheus Radio Project, and next to them was an organizer with a public access TV station in New York called Manhattan Neighborhood Network, a person that would go on to be a good friend of mine, Betty Yu. And the conversation that took place in that gathering was all about fighting back, challenging media consolidation in the courts, challenging it at the FCC, pushing for laws that would open the media system up, build alternatives that we could control, like community radio, like public access TV, like community owned Wi Fi networks. Um, these were organizers who understood that winning justice in the streets actually required us winning the battle of ideas first. That if we organized a protest with 5,000 people, and this happened to me a lot, and the news reported that it was hundreds, like the story that the public was getting was a lie. And bad policy follows bad stories. And what I found in that room in 2008 were my people, and I've been here ever since. Um, Back then in 2008, there was also a big election going on that year, and Barack Obama's campaign leveraged the internet in ways that allowed them to bypass like old political gatekeepers and old media gatekeepers for that matter. Many media activists and organizers that I worked with like saw the internet as a place where communities of color could get their stories out without being filtered, without being watered down, without being ignored. That the digital world was going to be this kind of like flattening and democratizing force, or as our senior advisor at Media Justice, Alfredo Lopez, called it, the internet was the largest social movement in history. That was its potential. And we weren't entirely wrong. In the years that followed, this sector won some very real fights. We helped pass the Local Community Radio Act, which put 1,000 new low power FM radio stations in communities across the country. We won net neutrality. We stopped the Comcast Time Warner merger. This is a sector and a movement that's known how to fight, and we know how to organize. But we were wrong about one thing. We were right that the internet would crack the door open, but we were wrong about who was going to walk through it. In 2018, about a decade later, Media Justice was part of a large coalition that pushed Facebook to conduct a civil rights audit of its platform. And we got one. We actually got it. What we didn't fully reckon with at the time was that Facebook got something in return. At the same time that they were agreeing with us to do a civil rights audit, they also agreed to do a conservative bias audit. Um, If you look back at the headlines from 2018, like the writing was on the wall. Facebook wasn't conceding any ground. They were just buying time, covering themselves with like a double-sided argument, like, sure, we're going to improve Facebook for users of color. And yeah, our platform is probably like biased against conservatives. Like, let us fix that. Um, and then like really just that double-sided argument, just let them keep doing exactly what they were doing, profiting from rage bait and hateful content. About a year ago, Zuckerberg ended fact checking for 3 billion users. And that happened just a few days before Donald Trump would take office again. He called it getting back to free expression. And what it actually was the culmination of a strategy that was visible in 2018 if you could like pay attention and knew where to look. Like we were part of a process that gave them cover to continue growing as a company, free of any regulation. And honestly, like I sit with that a lot. Um, so I tell you this story not to like really flog myself, but because this report is in part our effort to not make that mistake again. Under our new strategy, like we aim to see the system clearly, to name it directly, and not accept a partial concession when what we need is a structural fight. So I want to return very quickly to your question that kicked us off, Brandon. So I'll tell you like what my quick takeaways are from this report. The first thing is this, like pay attention to Larry Ellison. We've already talked about him pretty extensively, but of the many tech oligarchs that we've been writing about, talking about, paying, like directing people to, he is a big key figure that you must pay attention to. He is not just a guy who right now is like, he's building a huge media empire that's gonna compete with the likes of what Rupert Murdoch built with Fox. He is a part owner of TikTok. He controls its algorithm. And through Project Stargate, he is building the largest data center infrastructure in the country that's draining water and electricity from communities across the South and Southwest. Rising utility bills as a result in Black and Latino neighborhoods. And so he's a huge deal and someone to pay attention to. And so I would encourage you to like really look at that part of the report. The second thing that I'll say is there is a real financial crisis that is happening inside of media. Like news organizations are struggling to stay afloat, but that's not an accident. The business model of local journalism like was systematically dismantled, first by Wall Street and now by platforms who are positioning themselves as the rescue. Like, so when Ellison buys a drowning media company, that crisis looks like opportunity. But journalism is broken because these tech oligarchs have been allowed to like break it and to continue to break it. The third thing I'll say is that like the Black press and ethnic media are being completely left out. The AI late licensing deals that we cover in the report are reshaping how newsrooms survive. And the likes of the New York Times, Fox, the Associated Press, these are the outlets that are actually going to get to benefit from that pivot. At the AP, someone in leadership recently told their reporters that resistance to the integration of AI is futile. The media outlets that have actually historically provided the most accountable coverage of communities of color, your Black-owned newspapers, your Black-owned radio stations, your Spanish language TV stations, are absorbing the traffic losses that we talked about here without getting any of the revenue. And the longer these AI partnerships exist, the more it creates a two-tiered media system of the haves and have-nots. And so the last thing I'll say is and the one that I really want you to leave with, that we as a movement, as a sector, we have won before, and the conditions for winning again are already being built here. The organizers in the larger like media justice community, the fights happening right now over data centers, over flock cameras, over artificial intelligence, those are the same fight as this one. The physical infrastructure and the narrative infrastructure are controlled by the same people. And this report really is a map, and we hope that it's useful. We hope that you use it.
Yeah. Thank you, Stephen. I appreciate the stories you shared and how powerful a storyteller you are. We're going to invite some other amazing guests and storytellers who are with us tonight to join in the conversation with Stephen. So To start off, my former colleague, Alicia Bell, is now director of the Racial Equity and Journalism Fund at Borealis and the founder of one of the founders of Media 2070, an initiative to redress the harms of our media ecosystems on Black communities through a reparations framework. I'd also like to welcome Janine Jackson, program director at Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, FAIR. It's a media watch group, and Janine is also producer and host of FAIR's weekly radio show, CounterSpin. And finally, another former colleague of mine, Joe Torres, who's a senior advisor of reparative policy and programs at Free Press, and also one of the founders of Media 2070.
Right on. I'm like, who have you not worked with, Brandon? It's like everybody. Cool. Well, thank you so much for that intro, Brandon. I want to actually start with Joe Torres, my dear friend. You're someone actually that I would probably classify as a historian of media. I feel like every time I come across you, there's something new that you've uncovered in the archives, and like something that all that scholarship has led to is you have such an like deep understanding of the history of media in this country, well documented in News for All the People, the book that you co-authored with Juan Gonzalez. Um, and and I further expanded on in like the Media 2070 report. And I guess like the thing I'm kind of curious to ask you about to just kick it off is like what in this moment feels new to you? As you think about that long arc of media history, as you think about the many different media barons that have come and gone, what about this moment actually feels new, and what about this moment actually doesn't feel that new?
Well, no. Well, thanks for having me, and congratulations on the report. I'm also the board chair of Media Justice as well, so I want to put that out there as well. Um, yeah, it's completely moving what you were saying to me because I became awakened by all this through September 11th in the Iraq War. I was a person trying to increase diversity in newsrooms, through NHJ. And I started to see it as a structural issue slowly in before the war began. But then, after September 11th and, the run up to the war in Iraq, all these media companies were trying to massive consolidation of our media system. And we just celebrated the 30th anniversary of the Telecom Act, which opened up this massive consolidation that is it's definitely a factor for what we're dealing with today. As far as yeah, for me, the closest it's media. It just nothing is the same. Always things are always changing, and there's something new. But technology has always existed, and it's been in each iteration of it has been more powerful than the next and more insidious than the next. It's been able to get information out to the public faster. And so for me, something similar to what we see now, we see like a complete, like a marriage between the government. The government's always been intertwined with these companies one way or another, right? They don't just turn over these systems of power to anybody, especially if it's regulated. And so it's the during the lead up to World War One. As the U.S. got into World War One, we radio was just beginning, and radio was this wondrous technology. And there was a lot of black and brown folks and other communities of color who were experimenting with like radio. But the government came and entered into World War One. They shut down all the stations in the country. And then after the war, they sought to nationalize control over it. So they created the Radio Corporation of America, and that included General Electric, Westinghouse, United Fruit Company, AT&T. It was a way to control the patents of all the radio patents in order to create a commercial radio system. But it was also to ensure that radio was still and the US government had a seat on the chair of the board of Radio Corporation of America. So it was a way to ensure control over this new system. And then And then shortly afterwards, the birth of commercial radio happens, and there's all these universities and all that, all this like folks who were getting on the airways, and they kicked the folks all off the airways, and the Radio Corporation of America created NBC, two radio networks, and then CBS came along, and basically control of radio was turned over to these powerful companies who were controlling the majority of the programming people were hearing, the vast amount of program people were hearing. But it was a way for the government to be able to be in control with people they partnered with over a new distribution network for media. And so, and what did you get? And here, what you got was that one of the things that helped to the viability of radio, that can actually be you can actually make money off of advertising, and it actually could be viable. You can serve it can make money. Was minstrel shows, radio minstrel shows like Amos and Andy and all that, right? Radio shows. And so, and issues of race were not addressed, right? And no black, and then when the Federal Communication Commission came along, no black and brown person got a radio license, even though there was folks who wanted radio licenses. And so, so it just, each new iteration of technology is much more insidious. And what we have now is completely, because all the surveillance, and surveillance has always been a part of each new technology, So, but this is just much more insidious, as you're talking about the Ellisons and what they're building, and as far as the infrastructure, being able to have a profile on everybody in the world, basically. So I'll stop there, but that's what I say. It reminds me right now a little bit of the creation of the Radio Corporation of America, and the collusion between the federal government. And remember, this is Woodrow Wilson's administration, one of the most racist administrations prior to this one that existed, and who was helping to create. And of course, this was the time of the Nadir. This is the time, the Nadir happened, and it was still a backlash to these people who were creating this new technology and helping to create regulation. Were folks who were definitely folks who grew up on Reconstruction, and it was a time period of a backlash to Reconstruction that this system was being built.
Thank you so much for that, Joe. I mean, it just I think the parallels between then and now, I think are very aptly being drawn out by you. I think, and even further explored in your book. I just remember reading so many stories of the early days of radio, and how Black people, how brown folks all across the country were actually utilizing radio in substantive ways, almost like helping make the thing a thing, much like, internet users did in the early 2000s to make social media platforms, and our use of the internet as significant as it became. Like, there was so much innovation on behalf of our communities, and to get to a point where it gets captured and transformed and manipulated, and we get iced out. It's hard to not see those parallels now. um, I wanna bring in Janine into this conversation. And I'm so excited to invite you in, Janine, for so many reasons, just because of just your long-term presence in the media justice movement, as a long time, almost like you're like a living ancestor in many ways. I know you were at that 2002 gathering where a bunch of media
Yeah.
organizers, including Malkia, were at over at the Highlander Research Center.
Yeah.
And through your work at FAIR, you've just been documenting media bias for over 40 years. And even just
It's
before we jumped on, right, you were talking about all the stuff you have in the archives of conversations even involving Iran that we've had before that feel just like the same conversation. And I guess one of the arguments that we're trying to make in this report around capture is that ownership is not just about buying a business. It's about changing fundamentally the editorial direction and coverage of the media institutions that are captured. That who owns the newsroom actually shapes what the newsroom thinks, what it covers. And I'd love to kind of get your take on that relationship. What is your history of doing this work? Tell us about what happens when a Jeff Bezos buys the Washington Post or a Larry Ellison buys CBS. What does the history tell us about where this goes?
Absolutely, absolutely, and it's my pleasure to be here amongst friends. I'm going to asterisk living ancestor. We can discuss that later. But I do want to make clear, FAIR has been around for a long time. I've not been here the whole time, but FAIR's work has never been so much about prescribing answers for news media and how media should be. It's been much more about relentlessly asking questions, who gets to speak and who gets spoken about, which stories get lifted up and which get pushed down, So certainly 40 years on, the landscape has changed, but the questions really, really haven't. And that's because the questions are not so much about a particular outlet or owner or story or reporter. They're always questions about power. It's always about the news relationship to power, whether an outlet can say in a substantive and sustained way things that powerful people don't want said. So yes, we talk about particular conflicts of ownership and sponsorship, and you talk about them in the report. They can look like things like, a news outlet taking money from tobacco companies and then, well, unsurprisingly, slow footing their interest and their coverage in cancer, for example. You are funded by fossil fuels, you're not going to talk about climate change as much. If your defense contractors are bankrolling you, well, then your understanding and your presentation of news around warmongering is going to be affected by that. One of the things that's changed during FAIR's existence, that used to be considered a conspiracy theory, smoke-filled rooms, deals being made, and now it's understood that, well, yeah, if a fossil fuel company is paying your check, you're not going to be criticizing them. That's now more widely understood. What I want to say more broadly is that the timidity of corporate news media in doing power challenging stories, of course, has a harmful impact on those who are marginalized and worse, and that's the overarching problem, is the definition of news as what powerful people say and do, rather than what information communities need. People who want and need things to change because they're not okay for us are harmed by a press corps that is devoted to a kind of static sense of the right way for things to be, so that things that are calling for change are interpreted as disruption. History also demonstrates, in news media as in every other area, just an ongoing unwillingness to hire and promote Black and brown people. It's damaging everywhere, of course, but in journalism, we've seen that refusal leads to the erasure of perspectives and of entire stories. And it defines who in the news media are presented as us and who is them, right? And then I would also add these hiring problems and refusal to hire and also to promote internally Black and brown people leads to increased and weird pressures on the Black and Latino journalists that remain we know this from their testimony. Now they have to do all the Black stuff. Now you do these kinds of stories. And then they suggest that that's all you can do, right? As a journalist. So, but corporate media's rootedness in profiteering, which as Joe has explained and as others have talked about, is a historical decision. It's not the way it had to be. It was a historical decision that the way we learn about the world are going to be outlets that are owned and controlled by for-profit corporations. It also shows up in ways you might not necessarily think about that also affect communities of color. So you as an owner are cost cutting. We know that's what they do. You're thinking about the bottom line. Well, why not stop paying translators, in your foreign coverage? They cost money. You can do without them. Yeah, now you're only going to be hearing from people who can speak English, but your readers won't know that. They won't know who's missing. They won't know what's missing from that story that was made based on a business decision, an economic decision to cut costs. Well, why not lean on cheap to produce stories? That's another way to save money. Well, if we're talking about local news, we know what cheap to produce means. It means crime coverage, and we know the kinds of crimes that show up in that coverage, not because they are the crimes that are having the most impact societally, certainly not costing the most money societally, but they're the ones that you can put out a camera and do a story and come back in half an hour to the office. If your advertiser says, as they do, they don't want their ads to appear next to a story about poverty. They don't want their ads to appear next to a story about injustice. Well, you're going to do less of those because you need the ads, and again, a reader might not know that anything is missing. And let's never forget discounting, in which companies pay less to advertise or refuse to advertise at all on, in particular, radio, where we have this research, stations that reach primarily audiences of color, even when it is demonstrated that those audiences can and will buy the product being offered. One advertiser said, "We just don't want them in our store." So things that are thought of as simply business, simply economic decisions, even when they were thought of that way, they've always been racial. They've always had impact in that way. So these are structural conflicts. These are baked in conflicts that come from, again, the historical decision to make news a profit center rather than a public service. Now, today, you might say that what we're seeing today is those same kinds of structural conflicts in warp drive, intensified. And that's true. As public interest restraints, such as they were on concentration and cross-ownership, go by the wayside. And as the owners that we're talking about are basically completely upfront about their megalomania and about their biases, right? They're not even hiding anymore. And I just want to say a couple things because, of course, a lot of things are happening at once. First of all, as I indicated, any state safeguards about market concentration are being absolutely decimated and undercut. And what's more, whatever vestiges exist are being declared unnecessary, and maybe even unfair. Maybe they're hobbling businesses. The idea that there should be more than one owner in a given market, for example. These are presented now as leashes on businesses rather than as efforts to recognize media as having a public interest value. Market concentration, as is indicated in this report, works harder than ever to squeeze out those outlets, to make their lives financially impossible, the outlets that are most inclined to do stories affecting Black and Latino communities. Those are the ones being hardest hit in the way that the report outlines. Companies that used to just have some media in their portfolio are now very, very intentional, as we've discussed, about using that media to promote the goals of their other, quote unquote, holdings, including holdings like AI and data centers. And then, of course, there's this new expansiveness where companies have the power to shape the news that you're seeing invisibly, ensuring that you see a certain content making that other kinds of views are harder to find, but they present it as though it's coming from lots of different spaces, right? So you feel that you've read a lot of different things, a lot of different outlets, and yet you're still getting the same worldview. That echo chamber is so important because it makes it possible for someone like Chris Rufo, for example, to say, hey, you know what? Not to think it, to say it. I'm going to put out some poison about critical race theory. I'm just going to say some stuff. And you're going to see it in a whole bunch of places. And that's going to make it seem like it's a widely held worldview. And then outlets like the New York Times are going to have to cover it because it's a thing that's happening, right? Christopher Rufo, this is the loudest called shot in recent memory. He said, I don't know what critical race theory is, but I'm going to put out an idea about it and you're going to absorb that idea, right? And he was right. And then, of course, the overarching pushback on, let's say, the words diversity, equity, and inclusion. That is across the board, but it extends to media outlets themselves, many of whom we've seen extremely quick to jettison whatever meager programs they had to begin with, which suggests they weren't all that committed to them to start with. And then I would say, I think people are a little more divorced from the visible nuts and bolts of news. You don't get a paper. You don't watch the news at 6. It's just kind of always there, and it's less tethered. We are discouraged from tracing facts to sources. Following, I think wormholing is great. It's how I read. You start reading in one place, and then you're interested by the issue, and you follow that issue through various platforms, maybe even to media from other countries. But it does lead to the thing where we're talking to one another and we find ourselves saying, I saw somewhere, right? I saw this somewhere. I read this somewhere. We're discouraged from seeing news as something made by people for people. And so we're being discouraged to think in terms of accountability for that news. I'll end just by saying that there are a lot of things that are different in a good way as well. We are more aware, certainly in 1986 than in 1986 when FAIR started, of the influence of the elite media narrative, of the stories they tell, of the way that even if we imagine we're a nerd, we still are affected by those narratives in terms of our understanding of the world and of each other and of our possibilities. Of the fact people understand now that reporters don't have to be individually racist necessarily to carry water for racist projects. You don't have to say this reporter's a bad person to say this story still in its impact is excluding necessary perspectives and is putting forward an objectionable worldview. And we've moved beyond the idea that news is a sort of gift from corporations. There was an idea that they made money on the soap opera, they made money on the drama, but then they just gifted us this news. And that was just kind of noblesse oblige. And so you couldn't question it because it was a gift from corporations. We're well beyond that now, that understanding. Now we recognize that we have the standing to interrogate media and to demand better. So we have shifted the frame, I believe, successfully from seeing news as what corporations want to give us toward thinking about what information our communities need. And that is a much better standing, a much stronger standing with which we can go forward.
Thank you so much for landing us on that hopeful note as you also break out the many different business practices that happen in hidden and visible ways that affect the information that we get in front of us. And I'm just incredibly grateful for the work that you all do to continue bringing that critical lens into our information ecosystem. I'd love to pull in now our last guest, and for our last question, Alicia Bell, who throughout your career, Alicia, whether at Media 2070 or now in the racial equity and journalism project at Borealis, you've been doing something that's really not so easy to talk about and actually really hard to do. And that's helping build the case for what the alternative to this mess of a media system can look like. And I think you've got a much closer view on the things that are actually working than most of us. So I am kind of curious to ask you, what are the experiments that are giving you hope? And as you look at the current ecosystem, maybe perhaps a harder thing to answer is how is it that technology, algorithms, the ad economy, platforms are making it more difficult for those alternatives to really take hold? What are some of the obstacles you're seeing? So I'd love to turn it to you as we get towards the end here.
Sure. Thanks so much, Stephen. Honestly, after hearing you speak and Joseph and Janine, I was like, am I necessary here? I'm not sure.
You
'Cause that
absolutely are.
was like, that's so much information. You could really organize based on that alone and be good to go for a while. But I appreciate this question. I and the uplifting of some of the challenges that folks have done throughout this time together, starting with Brandon and Jelani, to the things you were lifting up, to Joseph, to Janine. I think what's at the core of some of these challenges, and one of the core challenges that we see, is that we're at a precipice point. We're in a place where folks recognize that we have a system that doesn't work for everyone. It's a system where not everyone gets to thrive, where folks want a new system, they want something else, they want to build something else. And also, folks are trying to figure out ways to survive and thrive while they're doing that. And so that's why you see organizations, small news organizations, large or news organizations, who are relying on big tech for things like ad revenue. They're relying on ads, on AI partnerships, on content creation. Um, there is a space where folks are like, well, if that's what, if AI generated videos of Martin Luther King playing basketball generate an audience and build an audience, then perhaps I need to be building an AI generated video of Martin Luther King playing basketball, because that's what will help me make money. And therefore I can provide for a staff, I can pay salaries for a staff, and they can feed their family. So we see this space where there is a lot of conflict amongst what is right and what is monetized. Um, and and I think what kind of surrounds that conflict, and what I see on a regular basis, I'm lucky with the Racial Equity and Journalism Fund to exist alongside colleagues at Borealis who are doing work around disability inclusion, folks who are doing work around communities, transforming policing relationships and transforming policing, folks who are doing work around really uplifting trans communities and LGBTQ and queer communities. And the thing that I love about that is that it really gets to this larger challenge, which is that we there is no economic parity that exists in the United States. Um, and all across the board, our cities, our counties, our states suffer from either a lack of infrastructure, or an issue of affordability. And oftentimes it's both a lack of infrastructure and a lack of affordability. And so if we live in cities and we live in counties and we live in states that are not affordable, that don't have the infrastructure that we need to survive, where we don't have the housing, the transportation, the food that we need, then it's much more difficult to build a people-powered media. It's much more difficult to build a revenue strategy and economic strategy that's based on people, that's based on individuals. Because the individuals who are engaging with some of the like Black and brown led news organizations that you're talking about are by and large not the communities that are disproportionately wealthy. And so because we have a lack of affordable cities, we also have a lack of space where folks can invest communally. But people still do it. Um, and we still see opportunities and glimpses of what's possible. And so I will say the things that feel the most possible, and the things that we see on a regular basis, is that one, this crisis and the clarity around crisis has created a global focus on the importance of journalism, a global focus on the importance of media, on the importance of kind of grappling with tech and with narrative. I think, but every single time I saw a count of how many journalists were being murdered in Palestine, it was a moment where folks were like, what are we allowing? What is a journalist? Like, what's the role of a journalist? And so we are in this moment where, because crisis is so close to us, we are also able to hold this kind of poly crisis in a way that is a little bit more near and dear, and is in our homes and with our families. And that's a double-edged sword. I think someone in the Q&A asked about what media to support. And I'm always lifting up Sahan Journal up in Minneapolis. And Vanan,
That's
who
right.
runs the Han Journal, has been telling folks for the past few months that this year has been one of their strongest fundraising years because people have been being deported and murdered and harmed because of ICE deployment in Minneapolis. So one of the things he's really grappling with as an immigrant-led and serving news organization is what does it mean that we generate the most revenue and the most income in the times where our people's lives are most at risk? And so this double-edged sword is a continuing challenge. Um, I will say the other thing that I see as an opportunity is that as we have started to study more and more about what works for news organizations, for small news organizations to grow and to sustain, one of the things we've seen is that community organizers, folks trained in community organizing and community development, those folk and community engagement, those folks make the strongest publishers. They sustain organizations, they sustain teams better, they grow money better, they have more analog practices when it comes to how they generate revenue. They're more community rooted when it comes to that. So the fact that, and that's work that we're working on releasing writ large, that full research, because it's important for folks to know, like, you don't necessarily have to invest in the person who has what seems like the strongest business strategy if you're actually trying to support community. And invest in the folks who have the soul of the community close to their hearts, and then you can build on top of that and support them. And then the last challenge I'll say is that, or sorry, the last opportunity, and I guess it's on the other side of a challenge, is that folks exist and are here. One of the things, the Racial Equity in Journalism Fund has existed for a little over 6 years, but we've been grant making and redistributing resources for 5 of those years. And in 5 years, we've never lost an organization. And that is sitting within the context of over the past 2 years, 266 news organizations, independent news organizations have closed. That breaks down to a rate of 2 to 3 news organizations per week. And so in a time where 2 to 3 newsrooms per week shut down, the Racial Equity and Journalism Fund has never lost a newsroom. And I think what that shows us is that when there's tender, adequate infrastructure, we can win. And so as long as we build it and invest in it, it means that we can win on that infrastructure. And so I guess in closing, what I'll say is that um, these things, it means that we have an abundance of challenges. It also means we have an abundance of opportunities. And as we consider what it means to be in poly crisis, I think we have to reconsider this framing of poly opportunity. I think about, I'm from North Carolina. I put in here that I'm in Texas because that's where I'm coming in from, but I'm from North Carolina. And at the space between North Carolina and Virginia is the Great Dismal Swamp. And in the Great Dismal Swamp are the bodies of fugitive slaves. And one of the things that the Great Dismal Swamp teaches us is that out of the poverty of maroonage, folks have been able to find abundance. And so that's a time where we're in now. We may not know what it looks like. The caterpillar doesn't know what it means to be a butterfly, but what we know is that it's possible and it happens all the time.
Mm, wow, what a way to land that. Thank you so much, Alicia, because I was just thinking as you were talking, the report ourselves, like we lay out a bunch of information. We actually don't make like a particular recommendation or an intervention inside of the report. And in part, because like it is not so certain what it can look like. But I'm really grateful for for your comments and for Janine and for Joe, because I think it gives us both a sense of like the context, the history, what's happening now, but also what's possible when we like put our put our support and our love into the community and build a media system that can reflect like our actual stories, our perspective, our culture. There's a lot of power in that, and no matter how deeply entrenched and deeply resourced the corporate media is, the possibility for alternatives to really not just survive but thrive are quite there. So grateful for the conversation. I'm gonna pass it to back to Dulani and Brandon to close us out. I know we're a little bit over time, but the conversation was riveting. So I'm really grateful.
Absolutely. That was really such a rich conversation. We're so deeply appreciative to all of our speakers. Their perspective is just invaluable. And we wrote this report because we believe it is critical to understand how the media system actually works and currently functions, because understanding this system is the first step in fighting it.
Yeah. Um, it really was an incredible conversation. You all took us to church, to the classroom, to the streets. And I hope that everybody that's joining us today, that you also will connect this fight and bring it with you wherever you go, whether you're fighting surveillance, whether you're bringing it to your church, to your classroom, to the streets. If you're organizing in surveillance technology, this report shows you how the same corporations expanding surveillance contracts with law enforcement agencies and ICE are also the ones controlling the platforms and outlets, shaping public opinion about the growing surveillance state. Our organizing strategies have to account both for the physical and narrative infrastructure that's impacting our communities.
Absolutely. And finally, we'd love to invite you to join us in person to talk about how we can start taking back control of the physical and narrative infrastructures that are oppressing our communities. So join us this April 17th to 19th in Atlanta at Take Back Tech 3 with Mejente. You can learn more about the convening, you can register, you can request financial support, you can submit your own workshop, all at takebacktech.com.
Yeah, come through. And if you have a workshop proposal, Monday's the deadline, so get on it this weekend. But we want to close out. Thank you all for joining us. I think we have one more slide to share that will show you how you can follow us and support our work. But we hope to see you all in April in Atlanta. Thank you so much.